Good morning. Let me just put my water down here. I've decided to abandon my PowerPoint presentation. I had a conversation this morning with somebody over breakfast, and they said, bring the power and get to the point. So I suppose the power really is that community has a lot more potential than we think it has. And I've been asked today to talk about the power of community in the context of criminal justice. And it's interesting because for me, one of the questions that we could really entertain at a conference like this is there a community alternative to incarceration? Imagine there was. Imagine there was a way that communities could create an alternative to what each of you do. It'd be a really interesting kind of thought experiment, because where it might take us is actually in the direction of completely imagining what we do. And it actually happened once in history, you know. In the 1970s, in Massachusetts, a guy by the name of Jerome Miller was invited in by the governor of the state to deal with a serious crisis that was happening at the time. So 11 reformatories had effectively, been outed in terms of the level of abuse that was going on in these reformatories. Places where young men were incarcerated and effectively, instead of having their lives transformed, were having their lives further destroyed. Instead of being empowered, they were being abused. And when Jerome Miller came in, a very well-known criminologist at the time, an academic, the governor said to him, essentially, put your practice where your mouth is. You talk a good show, but actually bring it. Bring the change. Show me what you can do. I'm giving you 2 years to reform these 11 institutions. And within 2 years, if you can't reform them, I'm giving you the power to shut them down. So Miller was, I guess, an academic, and so a bit of a scientist. So the first thing he did was he said, well, how am I going to know that I'm going to be successful? How am I going to know that I'm actually having impact? So he took a baseline. He looked at the level of recidivism that was in place as these kids were being released from each of these reformatories, took a baseline, and then he kind of pretty much agreed with his core team that he checked that baseline on a regular basis. Now, 2 years in to the conversation that he had had with the governor, what was very apparent was each of those reformatories had been reformed, right? He had transformed the way the professionals were thinking about their jobs. He had performed the, almost impossible act of obliterating abuse. And we all know how difficult that is in these systems. He had brought in new styles of training. He had really rethought the system in terms of what we mean by transformation instead of reformation, right? And he went back to his baseline. So here he was, best in class, the great reformer, internationally recognized as having achieved something that hardly any other bureaucrat in the criminal justice system in the world had achieved. This guy was Nobel Prize winning stuff at the time. And he went back to his baseline. And what do you think he discovered? Yeah, that's pretty right. Absolutely nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. So what he then began to realize, this is the hardest thing for a professional to realize, particularly a professional that's at the apex of his career, that there was absolutely nothing he could do to change the lives of these kids if the only tool he had in his toolbox was the reform of his system. He had literally come face to face with the limits of what the criminal justice system can do unilaterally. Because you see, the truth of the matter is, if the criminal justice system is trying to change lives on its own, it will fail. Because it's not designed to do that. At worst, it's the worst mental health institution in the country. At best, it helps people to change inside. But the critical question is, what happens when they get outside? And that's a question of community. And I really feel I've traveled all over the world kind of sharing this thought, and it feels to me like we're pushing water up a hill. Because institutions are becoming bigger, and the focus on reform is becoming more and more profound. We don't need to reform the criminal justice system. We need to refunction the criminal justice system, because form follows function. And if we don't know what our function is, we're never going to get the form. Our function, I believe, is not just to help people to, if you like, change their behavior. I think it's also to help communities to recognize the only way that you can create justice is by creating community. We live in a world, it's really interesting to me anyway, we live in a world, and many of the neighborhoods that we're particularly interested in, the neighborhoods where these young people and these so-called offenders come from, have been exiled from. The same communities where people are more statistically likely to be watching an episode of Neighbours or Friends than making friends with their neighbours. But there are also neighborhoods that are hugely resilient, neighborhoods that have phenomenal assets and strengths and power. And they're neighborhoods that for over 30 years we've neglected and disinvested. So actually for me, the criminal justice conversation and the changing lives conversation, it's not about criminal reform. It's a political issue. It's a social justice issue. So in the 70s, Miller had this evidence, and he had to do something with it, this great reformer, Jerome Miller. 11 institutions, nothing changed, but he reformed everything in terms of professional life. What was he to do with this? Well, as a great radical, and by radical I don't mean extremist, a radical is somebody who gets to the root of the problem, not an extremist that just cracks off and uses smart words to cover bad practice. A radical is somebody who's serious about using their resources to grow the solution to the root of the problem, rather than just dealing with the symptoms. He wanted to be a radical reformer, and what he understood was he couldn't do that by simply focusing on the system. What he had to figure out was, given the level of recidivism that he was looking at, even when the system was at its best, was what were the other locuses, what were the other areas where he could focus change on. And it dawned on him that actually the area where we were most likely to see long-term change in lives, was in communities, was in the places people were either exiled from or were returning to. And actually, it kind of struck him that it was quite amazing that the level of recidivism was so low, given what so many people are returning to. And so he started trying to figure out how he could use his resources to build community. This is a really interesting question for criminal justice all over the world. Are we using our resources to grow bigger institutions, or are we using our resources to grow stronger, more resilient, more competent, and more receptive communities? But the answer is probably a little bit of both. But it's a question of proportionality. Are we getting the proportion right? Miller is one of the most radical people in the criminal justice annals of history. Because what he said is, each year, he said this to the American public, obviously, each year I waste $70,000 incarcerating young men, your children, your neighbors, right? The people you've exiled for the system to fix or at least get out of your hair, if you have hair, right? And I can tell you, we have failed utterly. We're failing less utterly than we were 2 years ago, but I can report to you that the best I can achieve for your children and your neighbors is still the worst thing that could happen to them. So he said, I want to ask you a question as the public, given that I cannot unilaterally fix the challenges that we're facing, what would be a community alternative to what we're failing at doing? And he started a conversation across Massachusetts in the 1970s, which is one of the most radical conversations I've ever been aware of in the criminal justice system, where he seriously invited people outside of the criminal justice system to bring some thoughts and actions around what an alternative, a community alternative to incarceration would look like. One of my favorite examples of this came from the students' unions across the campuses in Massachusetts. So this was, the 70s, and students' unions were much more dynamic and active at that time than they are now. And so they were very interested in things like criminal justice, like why it was that certain young people got to go to college and others got to go to prison. That mattered to them at that time. We don't hear that so much, and it's tragic, actually. A lot of our institutions of learning now are more oriented on self-promotion rather than a just society. It'd be great to see more universities actually get back to their original mission. But at that time, they were kind of locked into that. And the students' unions were really radical, and they wanted to do something about the fact that where people were born and their postal code was determining their outcomes, not themselves as human beings. And so they came up with all kinds of radical ideas, but Jerome Miller's favorite idea came from a number of students in one of the universities who'd switched on to this idea that Pan Am Airlines, you remember Pan Am Airlines? Pan American Airlines. Pan Am Airlines in the 70s were the first airline to offer a round-the-world ticket. So you could buy a round-the-world ticket for $3,000 and basically bugger off for a year and travel all over the world. 7 flights, 77 flights, it didn't matter. Gone for the year. So these students had the gumption to say to Jerome Miller, you know what, give us $3,000 each, right? Give us $3,000 for the prisoner. We'll take them out of prison, bugger off for a year, travel around the world, and when we get, oh, give us $5,000, by the way, for out-of-pocket expenses. We won't stay anywhere fancy, but we'll have to eat and live, you know? And when we come back, we'll write you a report. I mean, there was no Facebook or Twitter or email at that time, right? So literally, I mean, we'll send you a postcard from Milan or whatever, but we're gone for a year. You know, just out of curiosity, I know you've had a number of very erudite presenters and speakers over the course of your careers. Have you ever met a bureaucrat that would say yes to a proposal like that in Scotland? I didn't think so. Well, Miller said yes, over and over again, to ideas as radical as that. And I think the reason that he said yes is because he understands that changing lives is not about changing prisons. It's not about changing programs. Changing lives is about ensuring that people, regardless of their past, have someone to love, somewhere to live, and something to do. It's that simple. And yet most of what we're focused on has nothing to do with those three things. Now, unfortunately, the only place you can get those three things is community. You cannot get them in prison, and you cannot get them in programs, and you cannot get them in partnerships with other institutions that are busy trying to reform their institutions. I often joke that in Europe, partnership is code for the mutual suppression of loathing in pursuit of government funding. Do you get that? A program is an artificial construct that enables the dance between agencies and funders. It does not change lives. People change lives. More personal agency, more connections with other human beings, and something meaningful to do. That's what changes lives. Figuring out how to do that means figuring out how we can get a balance between the service side of what we do and the community building side of what we do. Here's my challenge to you today. I think that criminal justice in this country has been flying on one wing. I think it's been flying on the wing of programs and services for far too long. I worked a lot in Brazil in the early 90s and had a post in Fortaleza, which is one of the hottest places on earth. It was so hot they used to joke that the flies used to fly on one wing because they needed the other one to fan themselves. Right? The second wing is the wing of being stewards of democracy, of being, in a way, the people who can use their resources to grow community. I think the future, the really exciting future, given legislative change that you heard something about yesterday, is a future whereby we can fly again on both wings, where we provide services and programs not as the point of first resort, but as last resort. And that we are working extraordinarily hard from the day we actually start to the day we finish on bringing that person back into an interdependent life. The challenge for criminal justice is simple. We've got to reduce dependence on our systems and programs, but at the same time, we've got to increase interdependence in community life. That's what Jerome Miller understood. He understood that he couldn't possibly, politically or ethically, shut down 11 institutions unless, at the same time, he could increase interdependency in community life. You can't do one without the other. We're creating all of these programs that enable people to feel better about themselves personally within an incarcerated setting. It doesn't matter how empowered a person is personally if they've got no connections when they get into community. In fact, most of the time, even though they bring their empowerment and they bring their transformation, they're walking right back into the very place that exiled them. That's what we've got to disrupt. That's what we've got to change. I wish I had more time, but just briefly, let me talk to you about how I think we can make that change come about. In the 1980s, Professor John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, two professors out of Northwestern University, and forgive them for being professors, because a long time before they were professors, they were people who were actually working in communities. They were brought in by the Kennedy administration at the time in the 70s to try to do something about criminal justice and to do something about what effectively were communities that were imploding, urban communities that were imploding in Chicago. So they came into Northwestern. And the thing that really struck them as they started figuring out, so what are we going to do? They set up this Center for Social Change. What are we going to do to create change in education, in health, in social justice, criminal justice? And the thing that really struck them, and struck them very hard, was that the only way we can affect any change around these issues is by making the change happen bottom up and inside out. That effectively, there is no cavalry riding into these communities. These people are the Calvary. So they spent 4 years traveling across some 300 or so neighborhoods that had been written off, neighborhoods that had been defined by, the half-empty part of the glass. So they were the backwaters of pathology, right? And they went into these neighborhoods and they spent considerable amounts of time just asking these neighborhoods to tell them, people in these neighborhoods, to tell them, what is it you do to create more healthy environments, to create more of a sense of safety and justice? And they gathered some 3,000 stories. This was back in the late 80s. We've been doing this all over the world now. And what we've discovered is that regardless of how difficult circumstances are in community, every community has an untapped reservoir of assets, of strengths, and of resources that could phenomenally change lives. But here's the rub. It's invisible. To people like you and me, we hardly ever see it because we're not looking for it. What we're largely looking for is what's missing in these neighborhoods, what's broken, the pathology. We're not interested in the acquisition and the consolidation of assets. We're interested in the management of pathologies. But actually what changes lives is community assets, not pathology management. We've literally got to shift back, and that's what McKnight and Kretzmann discovered, that in these communities, there was a huge, huge potential in terms of resources to actually transform lives and give people the opportunity not alone to return from prison and have a meaningful life, but not even to get there in the first place. There were 6 things that they identified, and it's interesting because wherever we go around the world now, and we're in about 12 sites across the UK and 4 here in Scotland, what we're discovering is there are community alternatives to incarceration. And actually, sometimes they're better. In fact, most of the time, they're better. But most communities do not believe in that potential. So work needs to be done in identifying, connecting, and mobilizing these 6 building blocks. So let me name the 6 building blocks for you, and then just conclude with a couple of comments. I think the 6 building blocks that will change lives and will change how we think about criminal justice into the future here in Scotland start with building block number 1, people. Let's stop talking about programs. And let's stop talking about our clients in our programs. And let's start talking about citizens and people. People who have the power to change their own lives, but also have the power to grow community where they live and where they return to. We have defined people by their clientelism, what they receive from us, the programs they consume. We define people as consumers instead of producers. Let's start defining people as producers of solutions and really believing that they can produce solutions. The second building block is associational life. We will not change lives by sending people on personal development programs. It will help, But what changes lives, if we understand that criminal justice is a political issue, is changing society. And that's about associational life. It's about getting connected up. I can be the most empowered person in the world, but if I walk into a situation that doesn't want me, my resilience is going to wear down. How do we actually create hospitable, welcoming communities who understand that the job of receiving somebody back from prison isn't a charitable act, it's a just act. It's an act of a citizen. It's an act of somebody who understands that my civic duty is to create a place of welcome. Not a religious or a charitable gesture, but a human one that understands our job and criminal justice is about getting better at being human together. That's the baseline. It's not an amazing achievement. So creating a situation, do you know that every neighborhood, of which there's about 10 in every country, that draws the vast majority of people that we label as prisoners, have a breakdown of community cohesion at the heart of their challenge? We do not have a youth problem or a criminal justice problem in this country. We have a village problem. If we can get to the root of our breakdown of social cohesion and strengthen these communities and really believe in them and invest in them, many of the people who currently we're serving in prison will be the people who will build their own communities tomorrow. So associational life is the second. The third building block are institutions that organize themselves the way people organize their lives. Most of our institutions wait for people to fit our criteria. You know, and what we might want to try to think about doing is figuring out how we could organize many of our resources to actually keep people out of fitting our criteria or away from our criteria. So how do we repatriate some of our resources and reorganize them to actually enable them to do what Jerome Miller was actually enabling them to do, to build those alternatives? There are two kinds of institutions in the world. There are institutions that are focused on themselves and building their prowess, their client base, and their economic revenue. And there are institutions that are actually focused on building community and keeping people out of their systems. We're not a business. Our job is not to get lots of clients and build our revenue. Our job is to keep people out of our services, not keep them happily in our services. How do we actually turn that on its head? That's the second or the third challenge. The fourth is to actually get serious about a building block called economic development or economic status. Poor people end up in prison more. We know this. And what makes the poor poorer makes the rich richer. So how do we actually seriously disrupt some of this and give people the opportunity, either before they get into prison or afterwards, to have a very, very real chance of gainful employment? This isn't a point just that relates to prison and to criminal justice. It relates right across the board. I've just come back from a trip in British Columbia, where today 70% of people who have intellectual or physical disabilities are in mainstream employment. 70%. It's unheard of in the world. And it took them 25 years to do it. Because 25 years ago, people in a different sector, but people just like us, got serious about building community. And now 70% of the people that would have been labeled and put in institutions are today out of institutions and have someone to love, somewhere to live, and something to do. And interestingly, they also have pensions. How many people with intellectual disabilities in this country have a pension? This is the heart of the challenge. The other building block, the fifth building block, is the building block of place. It's really interesting to me that whether we're talking about criminal justice or we're talking about social care, we're talking about health, or even just public safety generally, the way that we approach as helping professionals, communities, is actually doing more harm than good to them. Because what we do is we tangerinize communities. We step into the community, and the first thing we do is a needs analysis. So we find out what's broken, what's pathological. Tell me all your misery and all your problems, and we map all of that. It's called a needs analysis. The only thing that needs analysis in communities is needs analysis. Because what's interesting about needs analysis is it always concludes the same thing, that what these people need are the services of the people who are analyzing them. Is that curious? maybe in fact we need people's needs more than they need our services. Imagine if we flipped this, and instead of doing a needs analysis, we did an asset inventory. We actually started asking communities, what do you have around here that you could use to build stronger, more connected communities? And how could we form a halo of support around you to actually enable that to happen? What if instead of all of us paying community engagement officers to deal with people returning from prison, or to deal with aging well, or to deal with youth at risk, we actually started figuring out how to collaborate with each other and to work in place rather than siloing people. Because when you think about it, that's what we do. We take all of the youth at risk and we put them together with other youth at risk, don't we? And then somehow we fantasize that that will make them less at risk. I mean, this is not Nobel Prize winning stuff. This is about the dumbest idea I've ever come across. And that's what happens. When you put smart people in silos, they do dumb things. That's what silos do. They make smart people dumb. Place is a way of absolutely changing that game. If we got serious about place and actually used our leverage, you have immense leverage, you have immense convening power, to start knocking heads together and saying, let's get serious about sharing our resources so that we can enable every single community to get better connected and to start identifying, connecting, and mobilizing their resources. I'm going to time out, so I'll just give some maybe final closing thoughts. This kind of change is generational. It's going to take 25 to 30 years. But if we can get 2% increase year on year, we could achieve something similar to what's been achieved in British Columbia with regard to people with disabilities. And I think that that's not an unreasonable aspiration. And at the very least, it's worth setting out there and trying to achieve. But I think we can only also go at the speed of trust. We're not going to make this change happen in line or aligned with an election cycle or a funding cycle. I think the other thing is we've got to really get serious about making a shift from a focus on what's wrong to a focus on what's strong, and using what's strong within people and within communities to address what's wrong and to make what's strong even stronger. My final thought is this. I think all of us came into this work because we wanted to make change lives, change communities. And I think that hasn't changed. It might just have gotten a lot harder over the years. But in a way, each of us is a kind of a mini revolutionary. I think inside every public servant is a citizen waiting to get out. And I think the revolution that we want to create is a revolution where people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. So on with the revolution. Thank you.
Let's stay for a couple of questions here. Well, thanks very much indeed to Cormac for getting us underway. I'm keen to give you an opportunity to put a question or two to him before we move on to our next item. As usual, all you need to do is stick your hand in the air and keep it there until I can see you and get to you. I'll kick us off, Cormac, just by asking, what do you think the #1 barrier would be in Scottish social work, for instance, to making the sort of change that you're talking about?
I think the #1 barrier is that Scottish social work, and probably this is true of social work all over the world, has migrated from being oriented towards community social work into case-oriented social work. So that's the #1 barrier. And I think the challenge, and I think it's a challenge that would be supported by a lot of social workers, and probably you can remember doing some of this in the 80s, is to get back to being freed up to be able to do more community social work. And I think that's a legislative issue.
Well, that certainly has resonance with many people in the room. I noticed that you were nodding throughout much of that presentation. Just say who you are and what it was about what Cormac was saying that rung true for you.
Firstly, it's just a twitch I've got. My name's Alan Weaver. I don't have a question, but I just thought that was fantastic and it kind of brought me alive. And hopefully other people in the room will be the same, and I'm sure they will be. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm keen to take one or two more comments from around the room. I'm always happier to take volunteers than to create volunteers. Who just applauded the last thing that Cormac said? Stick up your hand if you applauded the comments that Cormac made. Right, there's a guy over here. Thanks very much indeed for putting your hand up. There's certainly many more than just you clapping. Why did you clap?
I clapped because I've heard Cormac before. But joking aside, by the way, I'm John Walker from Perth and Kinross Council. There's a lot of pessimism that's put about, particularly by the media. And we've heard yesterday from some speakers about a lack of political commitment to create community alternatives. You know, the prison population keeps on increasing, and you've got the Daily Mail and, you know, Sky News, whatever, keep on telling us to be scared. And I think what the power of what Cormac is saying is that if you have a relationship with a community, you can set that all aside, and they'll grow themselves. You know, they'll understand that, you know, they have got the power, and they can create, you know, the resources themselves to solve their own problems. And hopefully we can change society for the better at the same time.
That's brilliant.
Do you want to just come in on that, Cormac?
Well, I think, thank you, and I think the real challenge for journalism, particularly mainstream journalism, I think mainstream journalism thinks the reason that it's struggling is because of the internet and online social media. I think the reason it's struggling is because it spends too much time reporting on the wounds of community and not enough time on the power of community. And I think lobbies like people can create in this room should begin to engage with mainstream journalism and ask it to be generative. So instead of reporting on wounds, let's start reporting on potential. And I think if that happened, we could actually see journalism contributing to the building of a better Scotland rather than just taking the piss and reporting on wounds, which is a lot of what they do. So you'll forgive me, Glenn.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cormac Murphy.